In the 1890s, his name was H. Holmes. He is believed to have killed over 200 people before he got arrested. To the world, he was a charming doctor and a smart businessman. But under his polished and friendly surface, he was America's first serial killer. He was a man who didn't just murder people, but built a special place to do it. He built a hotel in Chicago, a huge building full of twists and turns. It was not a place for rest, but a place of terror. It was a castle of death, with hidden gas chambers, tables for cutting up bodies, and a furnace to burn the remains. This is the horrifying true story of H. Holmes and his infamous murder castle. But before he was the monster H. Holmes, he was a boy named Herman Webster Mudgett. He was born in 1861 in a small, quiet village in New Hampshire. By all accounts, he was a very smart, but strange and lonely child. His father was a strict and violent man. His mother was religious but cold. His childhood home was not a happy one. Stories from this time paint a very dark picture. It was said that he was cruel to animals, and that he liked to capture them and cut them open to see what was inside. He later told a story about his childhood that was very disturbing. He said that some older kids, knowing he was afraid of the local doctor's office, dragged him inside one day. They pushed his face into a real human skeleton that was used for teaching. They wanted to scare him. But instead of being scared, Holmes said he felt a cold, strange excitement. He said that moment ended his fear of death and started his dark interest in the human body. He was a brilliant student, and he eventually went to the University of Michigan to study medicine. It was in medical school, surrounded by dead bodies used for study, that he found a way to use his intelligence for evil. He began his life of crime not with a weapon, but with lies and stolen bodies. He started a brilliant and twisted scam to make money. First, he would take out a life insurance policy on a person he had made up. Then, he would steal a dead body from the university's lab. He would damage the body, sometimes with acid or fire, so no one could tell who it was. Then he would leave the body somewhere to be found, claiming it was the person from the insurance policy who had died in an accident. When the body was found, he would collect the insurance money. He did this many times, making thousands of dollars. It showed how smart he was, how cold-hearted he was, and how comfortable he was with death, long before he started killing. He was a master liar, a charming con man, and a brilliant manipulator. He had a hunger for money, for control over women, and for something much, much darker. After medical school, he left a trail of scams and broken promises across the country. He married a woman named Clara Lovering and had a son, but he soon abandoned them without a word. He moved from town to town, cheating people and disappearing before he could be caught. He knew that to continue his dark work, he needed a new name and a new identity. Herman Webster Mudgett needed to vanish. And so, in 1886, he arrived in the booming, chaotic city of Chicago. He was a new man, with a new name he had chosen in honor of the famous detective Sherlock Holmes. He now called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. He had found the perfect city to build his evil empire. A city that was about to host the massive 1893 World's Fair. A city full of excitement, full of opportunity, and full of countless people who could disappear without anyone ever noticing. The story of H. Holmes is not just about a man, but a place. A building that was carefully designed to be a factory of death. To understand the monster, we must first understand the evil lair he built. In August of 1886, a man calling himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes stepped off a train into the bustling, dirty, and chaotic city of Chicago. He was handsome, well-dressed, and incredibly charming. He had a special talent for making people trust him the moment they met him. He made his way to the suburb of Englewood, a growing, middle-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. There, on the busy corner of 63rd and Wallace Street, stood a small but successful drugstore. The store was owned by a woman named Elizabeth S. Holton. Holmes, using his medical degree and his confident, friendly personality, easily got a job working in the store. He was a brilliant pharmacist. He seemed to know exactly what to give people for their aches and pains. He was also an even better businessman. Customers loved him. They trusted his advice. The store's profits began to grow. But the owner, Mrs. Holton, was growing older. She was also dealing with a personal tragedy. Her husband was very sick with cancer. Holmes, who was an expert at finding and using people's weaknesses, saw his opportunity. He showed Mrs. Holton great kindness. He listened to her problems. He offered to help with the store. He made himself seem like the perfect, caring employee. Then, he made his move. He offered to buy the drugstore from her. He made a generous-sounding promise. She could sell him the store, and he would let her continue to live in the apartment upstairs, rent-free, for the rest of her life. It sounded like a wonderful deal for a tired, old woman with a dying husband. She agreed. But Holmes, being a master of lies and deception, never intended to pay her what he promised. He drafted a legal contract that was full of confusing language and loopholes. Instead of paying her with his own money, he used the store's own profits to slowly pay her off, a few dollars at a time. Mrs. Holton was trapped. Holmes now controlled her business and her home. Soon after the deal was made, Mrs. Holton and her husband simply disappeared. One day they were there, and the next they were gone. When curious neighbors and customers started asking where the old woman had gone, Holmes had a calm and ready answer. He would smile warmly and explain that she had decided to move to California to be with relatives. It was a long and difficult trip, he would say, and she was too old and tired to write letters. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was the charming, helpful, and successful Dr. Holmes. With the drugstore now fully his, he began to build his reputation in Englewood. He swindled his suppliers, ordering huge amounts of goods on credit with no intention of paying. He scammed his customers with fake medical cures and potions he mixed in the backroom. And he charmed the local women, starting affairs, borrowing money, and making promises of marriage he would never keep. He was a master of manipulation. He could make anyone believe anything. But the small drugstore was not big enough for his dark and twisted ambitions. He looked across the street at the large, empty lot on the opposite corner. It was a valuable piece of property, right on a busy streetcar line. And in his evil mind, he began to see a building unlike any other in the world. In 1887, he bought the lot using money he had swindled and borrowed from the women he charmed. And then, he began to build his dream. On the outside, it was meant to be a grand, three-story building, a monument to his success. The ground floor would have a brand new, much larger drugstore and other shops he could rent out. The top two floors would be a hotel, perfectly positioned to make a fortune from the millions of visitors who would soon flood Chicago for the 1893 World's Fair. That, at least, was the story he told everyone. The truth was a nightmare. The building that H. Holmes began to construct in 1887 was meant to look like a grand hotel from the outside. It was a three-story structure that took up an entire city block, a shining symbol of modern Chicago. But the way it was built was very strange and full of dark secrets. Holmes acted as his own architect, drawing up confusing and constantly changing plans. His designs were so complex and odd that many workers whispered that he must be crazy. But there was a very clear, very evil reason for the confusion. Holmes never kept the same construction crew for long. He would hire a team of builders to work on just one small part of the hotel, maybe one wall, or a single staircase. After a few days or weeks, he would fire them. Then, he would hire a brand new team to work on a different section, often changing the original plans. He did this over and over again, for years. He claimed it was because he was particular about the quality of work, or that he was always trying to improve the design. But the real reason was much more sinister. By constantly changing the workers, he made sure that no single person, other than himself, ever understood the building's true, nightmarish layout. No one could put all the pieces together. No one could guess the evil purpose of the structure. As the building slowly grew, strange features began to appear. It was a maze of hallways that led to nowhere, ending abruptly at brick walls. Staircases that had no destination, simply stopping on a landing or leading to a locked door. There were doors that opened onto solid brick walls, or into thin air several feet above the ground. There were more than 100 rooms in the hotel section, but many of them were not normal rooms at all. Some had no windows, trapping darkness inside. Others were soundproof, meaning no one could hear what was happening inside them. Some rooms had special peepholes and vents that allowed Holmes to watch and listen to his guests without them ever knowing. He installed hidden passages that he alone knew how to use, allowing him to move through the building like a ghost. There were trap doors on the floors of some rooms, hidden under rugs or furniture. These trap doors would open into chutes, like laundry chutes, that led directly down into the dark basement below. In his personal office, Holmes installed a massive walk-in vault. It was not for money, but for human storage, a place where he could lock his victims away, slowly suffocating them. His own bedroom had a special gas jet, a hidden pipe connected directly from his office. This allowed him to fill his room with gas, testing how long it took for a person to lose consciousness. And it also gave him the power to silently release gas into other soundproof rooms in the hotel, suffocating his unsuspecting guests as they slept. The people of Englewood watched the strange building grow on their corner. It was a monument to the success of their charming local doctor. It was almost complete, just in time for the Great World's Columbian Exposition. They had no idea what was truly being built on their corner. They were watching the construction of a murder castle. While the upper floors of H.H. Holmes's hotel were a deceptive labyrinth, the true purpose of the building lay hidden below, in the windowless depths of the basement. This was not just a storage area. This was the final destination for his victims, a meticulously designed space where life ended and gruesome work began. It was his personal laboratory, his butcher shop, his disposal site, and his secret graveyard, all in one. It was the black heart of the murder castle. To get a body from the upper floors to this horrific basement without being seen was a challenge Holmes had solved with chilling precision. He had engineered a system of hidden pathways and devices. There were trapdoors, cleverly concealed under rugs or within closets. These doors opened into steep, narrow chutes, like twisted laundry slides. To ensure quick and quiet passage, Holmes sometimes greased these chutes with oil, allowing a body to slide down swiftly and silently into the darkness below. Beyond the chutes, he also had a secret, soundproof elevator. This was not a regular elevator visible to guests. It was a dummy shaft, completely hidden from the official building plans, accessible only through a hidden panel in his private office. This allowed him to move his victims directly from the sealed, gas-filled rooms on the second floor down to his basement workshop, without anyone in the busy hotel above ever seeing or hearing a thing. It was a perfect, silent transport system for the dead. The basement itself was a waking nightmare, a stark contrast to the seemingly respectable hotel above. It was a cold, damp space with a packed earth floor that soaked up any spills. The air was thick with a sickly sweet, metallic smell of decay, mixed with the sharp, biting scent of strong chemicals, a smell that tried, but failed, to cover the true stench of death. The horrifying centerpiece of this room was a large, custom-built dissecting table. It was made of sturdy wood, deeply stained with dark, dried blood, and equipped with grooves and drains to channel away bodily fluids. Holmes proudly called it his articulating table, the place where he would prepare the skeletons of his victims for his macabre business. Next to this table were shelves and smaller tables. They were meticulously organized with a terrifying collection of surgical tools. Knives of every shape and size. Long, thin blades for precise cuts. Sharp scalpels lay beside heavy bone saws, chisels, and clamps. It was the clean, methodical setup of a surgeon, but it was used for the vile work of butchery. But Holmes needed more than just a place to cut up his victims. He needed a way to make them disappear forever. He was, above all, a practical monster. For this, he had installed several gruesome machines of disposal, each with a specific purpose. In one corner stood a massive, custom-built furnace, a crematorium with a large iron door, easily big enough for a human body. The fire within this furnace burned at incredibly high temperatures, so intense that it could reduce a person to ash and brittle bone fragments in a matter of hours, completely destroying all physical evidence of their existence. It was designed for total erasure. For the bodies he didn't burn, he had other, quieter methods. He built two large, deep vats into the basement floor. One he would fill with powerful, corrosive acids, capable of dissolving flesh. The other was a deep pit filled with quicklime, a white, chalky substance that rapidly decomposes a body, leaving little behind. And this was the most twisted part of Holmes's evil plan. Murder was his business. He wasn't just killing for the dark thrill of it, though he reveled in the power it gave him. He was doing it for cold, hard profit. In the late 1800s, medical schools across the country were in desperate need of human skeletons for study. There was a thriving, if often illegal, market for anatomical specimens. Holmes, with his medical training and lack of morals, saw a brilliant business opportunity. He would use his surgical tools to expertly strip the flesh from the bones of his victims. He would then clean the skeletons, sometimes bleaching them, and piece them back together with wire. He would sell the finished, articulated skeletons for a significant profit to unsuspecting medical institutions. He was, in a chilling sense, a human recycling plant, turning the people he murdered into a product he could sell. The basement also contained other horrors that spoke to his evil imagination. There was a medieval-style stretching rack, an instrument of torture designed to slowly pull a person's limbs from their sockets. While no one knows for sure if he ever used it on a living person, its very presence showed his dark fascination with pain and control. By 1893, the Devil's Workshop was complete and fully operational. The hotel above was ready for guests, and the world was coming to Chicago. The Great World's Columbian Exposition was about to open its gates. H. Holmes, the charming doctor, stood waiting like a spider in the center of his perfectly designed web, ready for the endless supply of unsuspecting victims that would soon arrive at his door. By May 1st, 1893, the Devil's Workshop was complete. The hotel above was ready for guests, and the world was coming to Chicago, a city in the grip of a feverish excitement. The World's Columbian Exposition opened its gates on that spring day. It was a spectacle unlike anything the world had ever seen, a moment of pure, unabashed American pride and boundless optimism. It was a massive, temporary city, meticulously planned and built on the swampy shores of Lake Michigan. A gleaming, dreamlike metropolis of enormous white buildings, designed in the grand, classical style of ancient Greece and Rome. It was nicknamed the White City, and it was meant to be a vision of a perfect, orderly, and beautiful future. Every aspect of the fair was designed to inspire awe and demonstrate America's technological and cultural superiority. It was a celebration of progress, of innovation, of the dawn of a new American century. For the first time in history, millions of people saw the magic of electric light. Thousands of brand-new incandescent bulbs from the Westinghouse Electric Company turned the night into day, illuminating the grand buildings and waterways. This was a breathtaking sight for people who had only known gaslight and candles. The dazzling effect of the electrified White City was itself a major attraction, drawing visitors back night after night. They saw the world's first ever Ferris wheel, a terrifying and thrilling marvel of engineering invented by George Ferris as America's answer to the Eiffel Tower. It soared 26 stories into the sky, carrying over 2,000 passengers at a time in its 36 luxurious cars, offering a godlike view of the sprawling fairgrounds and the city beyond. People lined up for hours, eager for the experience. They saw exotic new foods and products that would soon become household staples, like Cracker Jack, juicy fruit gum, and Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. They sampled shredded wheat, learned about Quaker oats, and tasted new fruit juices. They witnessed incredible new inventions, from the zipper to the moving sidewalk, and explored grand pavilions showcasing wonders from countries all around the world. For 6 months, more than 27 million people, nearly half the population of the United States at the time, flocked to Chicago from every corner of the globe. The fair was not just an event, it was a cultural phenomenon, a pivotal moment in American history. The mood in the city was one of wonder, excitement, and endless possibility. But this bright, optimistic, white city had a dark, festering shadow that lurked just beyond its gates. The rest of Chicago was a sprawling, chaotic, and often dangerous metropolis. It was a city of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, a place of saints and sinners, where the police force was often corrupt, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Crime thrived in the overcrowded streets, and the sheer number of visitors made it easy for people to simply vanish. The World's Fair created the perfect hunting ground for a predator like H. Holmes. It brought a massive, endless supply of tourists to the city, many of whom were exactly what Holmes sought: young, naive, and alone, with no one to notice if they suddenly went missing. Hotels across the city were overflowing, and people were desperate for a place to stay, often settling for less than ideal accommodations. And just a few miles south of the fairgrounds, on a busy streetcar line, stood the brand-new World's Fair Hotel, owned by the charming Dr. Holmes. He advertised his hotel widely in newspapers and pamphlets that were distributed throughout the city and at the fairgrounds. His ads promised convenient location, affordable rates, and comfortable rooms, appealing directly to the influx of visitors. The beautiful new drugstore, a seemingly reputable jewelry store, and even a bustling restaurant on the ground floor gave the building an air of respectability and enterprise. It looked like a safe and modern establishment, a beacon of success in a busy neighborhood. It was the perfect trap, carefully disguised as an opportunity. As the fair opened and the city swelled with visitors, Holmes began to select his prey with chilling precision. He preyed on the vulnerable and the hopeful. His ideal victims were young, single women who had come to the big city seeking jobs, independence, or perhaps a husband. They were often far from home, disconnected from their families, with no immediate network of friends or relatives nearby to check on them. They were looking for the kind of life that a handsome, wealthy, and seemingly successful doctor could offer, a promise of security and a future. Holmes's charm was his primary weapon, more deadly than any gun or knife. He would meet these women, sometimes at the fair, sometimes in his drugstore, sometimes through newspaper advertisements for jobs. He would immediately sweep them off their feet with his practiced charisma. He was the perfect gentleman, polite, intelligent, attentive, and incredibly persuasive. He would offer them jobs in his hotel, perhaps as a clerk, a housekeeper, or his personal secretary. These positions came with the irresistible promise of a good salary and, crucially, a place to live right there in his grand new building, a safe room in a reputable hotel during the chaotic fair season. He would woo them with lavish gifts, constant attention, and grand promises of a bright and wealthy future. He would often propose marriage, sometimes to several different women in the same week, convincing each one that she was his one true love, the only woman for him. He was an expert at making each woman feel uniquely special and important, isolating them psychologically even before he isolated them physically. He used their hopes, their dreams, their innocence, and their loneliness as bait to lure them into his meticulously constructed web. One of his earliest and most tragic victims in the castle was a woman named Julia Connor. She was married to a man, Ned, who worked in Holmes's jewelry store on the ground floor. Holmes quickly seduced Julia and began a brazen affair with her. When Ned found out about the affair, rather than confront Holmes directly, he quietly left his wife and their young daughter, Pearl, and moved away, abandoning them. This left Julia and Pearl completely vulnerable and entirely under Holmes's control. Julia, believing Holmes truly loved her and would marry her, moved into the hotel with Pearl, dreaming of a new life as the new Mrs. Holmes. Another victim was the beautiful and ambitious Emmeline Sigrand, who hailed from Lafayette, Indiana. Holmes met her while she was working at a sanatorium and, impressed by her intelligence and beauty, offered her a position as his personal secretary. He quickly charmed her with his knowledge, his apparent wealth, and his attentive nature. He proposed marriage, and Emmeline, believing she had found her dream man and a ticket to a grand life in Chicago, happily accepted. She was another perfect victim, a young woman with dreams, far from her family, whose disappearance would not be noticed for some time. Then there were the two sisters, Minnie and Nanny Williams, from a wealthy family in Mississippi and Texas. Minnie Williams was a beautiful and educated woman who had inherited a large fortune and valuable property in Fort Worth, Texas. Holmes met Minnie in Chicago, likely through her social connections, and immediately set about seducing her. He swept her off her feet with his charm and fabricated tales of his wealth and prestige. He proposed marriage, and Minnie, deeply in love and trusting, agreed. Under his persuasive influence, she signed over her entire fortune and her valuable Texas property to him, trusting him to manage her assets as her soon-to-be husband. He then convinced Minnie to invite her younger sister, Nanny, to come live with them in his grand Chicago hotel, promising a joyful family reunion. Nanny soon arrived, only to find herself also trapped within the castle's walls. Holmes would later claim he married Minnie in a private ceremony, further cementing his control over her and her money. These women, and countless others like them, all had one chilling thing in common. They trusted him completely. They saw him as their savior, their ticket to a new and better life, or simply a respectable host during the excitement of the World's Fair. They had no idea that when they checked into the World's Fair hotel, they were checking out of the world forever. The fair was in full swing, a dazzling beacon of humanity's progress. The crowds were pouring in, millions of eager faces focused on the wonders of the White City. And H. Holmes stood at the door of his castle, smiling, a polite and welcoming host, as he ushered his next victim into the labyrinth of death. His methods were varied, but all led to the same terrifying outcome. Sometimes, he would lock a woman in her soundproof room, turning on the gas from his office, listening to her cries fade away. Other times, he would administer a poisoned drink, or perhaps simply strangle them in a moment of fury or cold calculation. Once dead, the bodies were rarely given a proper burial. Instead, they were quickly sent down the secret chutes to the waiting horrors of the basement. The World's Fair continued its grand run, a shining symbol of civilization. But in its shadow, in a nondescript hotel in Englewood, a monster worked tirelessly, unseen, unheard, and unsuspected. The smoke from his basement crematorium blended seamlessly with the industrial haze of Chicago, and the faint smell of chemicals was just another part of the city's unique aroma. No one suspected that one man, driven by greed and a chilling lack of empathy, was turning human lives into profit, all under the cover of the greatest show on earth. The screams were silenced by soundproof walls. The disappearances were lost in the millions of visitors. The World's Fair was a triumph of human ingenuity. The murder castle was its dark, hidden counterpart. As the World's Fair raged on, turning Chicago into the center of the universe, H. Holmes began to operate his murder castle with cold, factory-like efficiency. He was no longer just a con man. He was a hunter, and his hotel was the perfect, deadly trap. His methods of murder were varied, scientific, and tailored to each victim and situation. He was a methodical killer who enjoyed the process, the control, and the final, terrible outcome. Let's look at the fate of Julia Connor and her young daughter, Pearl. Julia, who had become Holmes's mistress, soon discovered she was pregnant with his child. This was a complication Holmes would not tolerate. It was a loose end that needed to be tied. On Christmas Eve of 1891, even before the fair began, he performed a gruesome procedure on Julia in one of the hotel's rooms. He told her it was an abortion, but the procedure was intentionally botched. Julia died in agony on his operating table. Her daughter, Pearl, was now a witness, an orphan, and a burden. It is believed Holmes gave her a poisoned drink, and her small body soon joined her mother's. He later had their skeletons cleaned and sold them to a medical school. 2 lives erased for convenience, their bones ending up as classroom exhibits. Then there was Emmeline Sigrand, the beautiful and ambitious secretary he had lured from Indiana. Holmes showered her with affection and expensive gifts. He made her believe she was the future Mrs. Holmes. She wrote glowing letters to her family, telling them of the wonderful, wealthy doctor she was going to marry. But after a few months, Emmeline began to see glimpses of the monster beneath the charm. She may have discovered his other affairs, or perhaps she stumbled upon one of the castle's dark secrets. She confronted him. Her mistake was believing he would let her leave. In December of 1892, Holmes led Emmeline to his office on the 2nd floor. He likely asked her to step inside his massive, walk-in vault, perhaps on the pretense of showing her something valuable. Once she was inside, he swung the heavy, soundproof door shut and locked it from the outside. Inside the dark, airtight vault, Emmeline would have screamed and pounded on the walls, but no one would have heard her. Holmes could sit comfortably at his desk, just a few feet away, and listen as she slowly suffocated. Her death was not quick. It was a slow, terrifying descent into darkness. He later had her skeleton prepared and sold it, along with her belongings, for a handsome profit. Perhaps his most cold-blooded acts were against the Williams sisters, Minnie and Nanny. Minnie, the wealthy heiress, had signed over her entire fortune and her valuable Texas property to Holmes. She believed they were married and that he was her loving husband. He invited her and her sister, Nanny, to live with him in the castle during the World's Fair. He showered them with attention, taking them to see the wonders of the White City. But soon, Nanny, who was more suspicious than her sister, began to ask difficult questions. She was worried about Minnie's fortune, and she was wary of Dr. Holmes's smooth-talking charm. Nanny became a threat to Holmes's plans. In July of 1893, at the height of the fair, Holmes took Nanny into one of his sealed, windowless rooms. He likely told her it was a private place where they could talk. Once inside, he turned on the hidden gas jet, a pipe that led directly from his office. As the poisonous gas filled the room, Nanny would have grown dizzy, then panicked, clawing at the door that would not open. Holmes could watch her through a secret peephole as she collapsed and died. A few days later, he did the same to her sister, Minnie. He had gotten her fortune. She was no longer of any use to him. He disposed of their bodies in the basement, likely in the vats of acid or the crematorium. He then calmly told people who asked that the two rich sisters had decided to take a long, extended trip to Europe. No one suspected a thing. This was the pattern: lure, isolate, murder, and dispose. He preyed on his own employees, on the guests who checked into his hotel, and on the countless young women who came to Chicago with dreams in their eyes. He would often require his female employees to take out life insurance policies, which he would kindly offer to pay for. He would, of course, list himself as the sole beneficiary. Their lives became a commodity, their deaths a simple matter of business. And all the while, the hotel continued to operate. Guests came and went from the normal rooms. The shops on the ground floor were busy. The charming Dr. Holmes would greet his neighbors on the street, a pillar of the community. No one knew that just above their heads, behind a soundproof wall, a human being was being gassed to death. No one knew that in the basement below, a body was being methodically dissected for profit. The murder castle was a perfectly designed machine, and H. Holmes was its tireless, evil operator. The screams were silenced by soundproof walls. The disappearances were lost in the millions of visitors who flooded the city. The Great World's Fair was a triumph of human ingenuity. The murder castle was its dark, hidden, and evil counterpart. Before we continue to his darkest evils, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel, Faded Footprints. Here we tell real-life, dark, true crime stories, with full details of when it happened. And if there's any dark crime story you want me to make or you need more details about, tell me in the comments so I will do my research about it. The Great World's Fair, a shining beacon of progress and excitement, finally closed its gates in October of 1893. The magical White City was dismantled, its grand buildings torn down. The millions of visitors who had flooded Chicago for 6 months now dispersed, returning to their homes across the country and the world. For the city, it was the end of a triumphant and profitable era. For H. Holmes, it was a major problem. The constant flow of tourists had been the lifeblood of his murderous enterprise. The massive crowds had provided him with an endless supply of victims and the perfect cover for their disappearances. Now, that supply had dried up. Englewood was returning to a quiet, familiar neighborhood where a missing person would be noticed. The murder castle, his factory of death, was now quiet. Creditors he had been avoiding for years began to close in, demanding payment for the construction of his hotel. His financial scams were catching up to him, and without a steady stream of victims to rob, his money was running out. It was time for Holmes to disappear as well. He abandoned his castle, leaving it to the rats and the ghosts of his victims, and set a fire to try and destroy the evidence, hoping to collect insurance money on the building itself. He then fled Chicago, a wanted man, not for murder, but for his numerous financial crimes. He was a shark that needed to keep moving, and he was looking for a new, even more audacious scam to fund his dark passions. His eyes turned to his most loyal, unsuspecting associate, Benjamin Pitezel. Benjamin Pitezel was a carpenter and a small-time criminal who had worked for Holmes for years. He was a devoted family man, but he was also weak-willed and completely under Holmes's charismatic spell. He was a recovering alcoholic with a wife, Carrie, and 5 young children he desperately wanted to provide for. Pitezel had helped Holmes build many of the secret features of the murder castle. He knew its hidden passages and its strange layout, even if he likely didn't understand the full, horrific extent of what happened there. He had been Holmes's right-hand man in countless scams, a loyal and easily manipulated partner. Now, Holmes cooked up a plan that was as brilliant as it was evil, and he made Pitezel the star of the show. He wanted to fake Pitezel's death to collect a large sum of life insurance money. The plan was simple. Pitezel would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy, making his wife, Carrie, the beneficiary. Then, Pitezel would go into hiding, and Holmes would find an unidentifiable body from a morgue to use as a stand-in. They would stage an accidental death, perhaps a lab explosion, that would leave the body badly burned. Holmes would then use his medical knowledge and charm to officially identify the burned corpse as Benjamin Pitezel. They would then collect the insurance money, split it, and live wealthy lives. Pitezel, desperate for money to finally give his family a better life, and trusting Holmes completely, agreed to the dangerous scheme. But Holmes, with his utterly cold and greedy heart, had no intention of faking anything. A fake death was too complicated. A real death was much simpler, and it meant he wouldn't have to share the money. Pitzel was becoming too knowledgeable, too much of a risk. He knew too many of Holmes's secrets. In September 1894, Holmes rented a house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He convinced Pitzel to travel there, promising to meet him later to carry out the fake death. When Holmes met Pitzel in the Philadelphia house, he likely gave him a large dose of chloroform, a chemical to make him unconscious, explaining it was part of their plan for the fake death. But instead of simply letting Pitzel wake up later, Holmes brutally murdered him. He then used chemicals to set the body on fire, destroying Pitzel's face to make the body unrecognizable, just as their original plan had intended. He had committed the perfect murder, disguised as a clever scam. Holmes then calmly contacted Carrie Pitzel, Benjamin's grieving wife. He spun a convincing, sympathetic tale. He told her that their plan had gone horribly wrong. He claimed that Benjamin, while preparing the accident, had gotten drunk and accidentally killed himself for real. He presented himself as a loyal friend, devastated by the loss of his partner. He manipulated Carrie into believing he was her kind protector, her husband's most trusted friend, now looking out for her and her children in their time of need. He convinced her to let him help her collect the $10,000 insurance money, knowing that a grieving, confused widow would be easier to control. Carrie, heartbroken and completely trusting of Holmes, agreed to his every suggestion. She had no idea she was putting her faith and her children's lives in the hands of the very man who had just brutally murdered her husband. After the successful insurance scam, Holmes had what he wanted, a large sum of money and a clean getaway from the murder of Benjamin Pitzel. But his evil didn't stop there. He now had control over Pitzel's grieving widow, Carrie, and her three eldest children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard. They were a loose end. They were a liability. And in the mind of Holmes, they were also an opportunity for more manipulation and cruelty. He began a twisted and elaborate game of deception with the heartbroken Carrie Pitzel. He told her that her husband, Benjamin, was not actually dead. He lied and said that the burned body was a substitute, just as they had planned, and that Benjamin was alive and well, hiding out in London, England. He told her that the police were now investigating the insurance fraud, and that she and her children were in grave danger of being arrested. He presented himself as her sole protector, the only one who could keep her family safe and reunite them with her husband. Carrie, confused, grieving, and terrified of going to jail, believed every word. She placed her complete trust in the man who had murdered her husband. To maintain control, Holmes insisted that the family be separated. He told Carrie it was too dangerous for them to be seen together. He took her and her two youngest children, Dessa and a baby named Wharton, and moved them from city to city, from one cheap hotel to another. At the same time, he took the three older children, 15-year-old Alice, 11-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard, under his personal care. He now had two separate groups of hostages, each unaware of the other's true location. He was the puppet master, pulling all the strings. Holmes then began a horrifying and tragic journey with the three innocent Pitzel children. He led them on a grim, cross-country chase across the northern United States and into Canada. He was constantly moving, never staying in one place for more than a few days, always one step ahead of anyone who might ask questions. To the children, he was Uncle Henry. He would alternate between being a kind, fun guardian, buying them toys and telling them exciting stories, and being a stern, menacing figure who demanded their absolute obedience. He lied to them constantly. He told them that their father was waiting for them, that they were on a grand adventure, and that their family would soon be reunited in a beautiful new home. The children, confused, scared, and desperately missing their mother, had no choice but to believe him. All the while, Holmes was writing letters to the frantic Carrie Pitzel. He would write in a cheerful tone, telling her that her children were safe, happy, and having a wonderful time on their trip. He would even force the children to write letters to their mother, telling them what to say, filling the pages with lies about how much fun they were having and how they couldn't wait to see her and their father again. These letters were a cruel and calculated tool of psychological torture, designed to keep Carrie hopeful, compliant, and under his complete control. But Holmes never meant for the children to be reunited with their mother. They were witnesses to his crimes. They knew too much. He needed them to be silenced, forever. The horrific end for the two Pitzel girls came in Toronto, Canada. In October 1894, Holmes rented a small house at 16 St. Vincent Street. He brought Alice and Nellie to the empty house. He told them he had a surprise for them, a large new toy he had bought. It was a heavy, airtight trunk. The details of what happened next are almost too horrible to imagine. He likely forced the two terrified girls into the trunk, one after the other. He then drilled a small hole in the top, connected a hose to a nearby gas jet, and filled the trunk with poisonous gas until they slowly suffocated. It was a silent, horrific death, a method he had perfected in his murder castle. He then buried the trunk containing their bodies in the dirt floor of the cellar, covering it with a thin layer of earth. His evil work was not finished. He still had the boy, Howard. He traveled to Indianapolis, where he had left Howard in a hotel. He rented another small cottage in the suburb of Irvington. There, he murdered the 8-year-old boy. The method was likely more brutal and hands-on than the gas he used on the girls. He then dismembered the boy's body, using the same gruesome surgical skills he had perfected in Chicago. He burned the remains in a large wood-burning stove in the cottage's kitchen. He worked for hours, carefully breaking the bones and turning the body to ash, destroying all evidence of his terrible crime. Holmes continued his travels, living under different names, always moving, always looking for new ways to scam and steal. He believed he was untouchable, too clever to be caught. He was a master of disguise and deception. But the insurance company that had paid out the $10,000 for Benjamin Pitzel's death was growing suspicious. They had hired a relentless investigator to look into the case. His name was Frank Geyer, a veteran detective from the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Geyer was known for his incredible patience, his sharp mind, and his almost psychic ability to follow a cold, confusing trail. And Holmes, despite all his cunning and all his careful planning, had made mistakes. He had left a trail. The walls were finally beginning to close in on America's first serial killer. While H. Holmes was moving across the country like a phantom, leaving a trail of death and deceit, a new player entered the game. He was a man who could not be charmed, a mind that could not be tricked, and a force of will that was as relentless as Holmes's own evil. His name was Frank Geyer, a veteran detective from the famous Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company had paid out the $10,000 for Benjamin Pitzel's death, but they were suspicious. They had received a tip from one of Holmes's former cellmates, a train robber named Marion Hedgepeth, who Holmes had promised a cut of the insurance money to, but never paid. Hedgepeth, angry at being cheated, told the police about the insurance scam. The insurance company hired the Pinkertons, and Frank Geyer was assigned to the case. Geyer's initial task was simple: find Benjamin Pitzel and his 3 missing children to prove the insurance claim was a fraud. He had no idea, at first, that he was hunting a serial killer. He believed he was simply chasing a clever con man. The challenge was immense. Holmes was a master of disguise and deception. He used dozens of different names or aliases like H.M. Howard, D.A. Spencer, and G.D. Hall. He was constantly moving, crisscrossing the country by train, never staying in one place for long. It was like trying to catch smoke. Geyer was a patient and methodical detective. He started his investigation in Philadelphia, the city where Pitzel had supposedly died. He began by talking to everyone he could find who knew Holmes or Pitzel. He slowly and carefully began to piece together a timeline of Holmes's movements after the insurance claim was paid. His investigation soon led him to the heartbroken and confused Carrie Pitzel, the widow of Holmes's victim. Geyer listened to her story. She told him that Dr. Holmes, her husband's trusted friend, had taken her 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to keep them safe. She showed Geyer the letters she had received from Holmes and her children, letters full of lies about their father being alive and their happy travels. Geyer immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. He saw the manipulation, the cruel game Holmes was playing. The case was no longer just about insurance fraud. It was about 3 missing, innocent children. Using the postmarks on the letters as a guide, Frank Geyer began a grim and exhausting journey. He was literally following the ghost of H. Holmes, retracing the path he had taken with the 3 Pitzel children. His journey took him from city to city, from Cincinnati to Detroit, and then up into Toronto, Canada. In each city, He would show photographs of Holmes and the three children to hotel clerks, landlords, and shopkeepers. It was slow, painstaking work. In city after city, he would find people who remembered the charming Dr. Howard and the three sad-looking children who were with him. Witnesses reported that the children seemed unhappy, that they looked scared, and that Holmes was very strict with them. Geyer could feel the trail getting colder, the sense of dread growing with every mile he traveled. His big breakthrough came in Toronto. After days of searching, he found a rental agent who remembered leasing a small house at 16 St. Vincent Street to a man matching Holmes's description. Geyer went to the house. It was empty. He began to search the cellar. The air was cold and musty. He noticed a section of the dirt floor that was soft and uneven. He began to dig. Just a few feet down, his shovel struck something hard. It was a large, heavy trunk. He pried it open. Inside, he found the naked, decomposing bodies of the two Pittsville girls, Alice and Nellie. They had been crammed into the box, one on top of the other. The cause of death was clear. They had been gassed. The discovery was a national sensation. The newspapers screamed with headlines about the monstrous crime. The story of the charming doctor had now become a tale of a child killer. But Geyer's work was not done. One child was still missing, young Howard Pittsville. The detective, heartbroken but more determined than ever, continued his grim pursuit. The trail led him from Toronto to Indianapolis. Once again, he began the slow process of showing pictures, asking questions, and searching rental records. He eventually found a small cottage in the suburb of Irvington that Holmes had rented. He searched the house. In the kitchen, he found a large, pot-bellied stove. Inside, among the ashes, he made a horrifying discovery. He found small pieces of bone, some teeth, and a piece of a child's coat. He also found a strange, greasy residue coating the inside of the chimney. Holmes had burned the boy's body in the stove, a process that took hours of gruesome work. The evidence was undeniable. All three Pittsville children were dead. While Geyer was uncovering these horrors, the law was finally catching up to H. Holmes. He had continued his life of crime, moving from state to state. But the Pinkerton Agency had put out a nationwide alert for his arrest. In November of 1894, H. Holmes was finally arrested in Boston, Massachusetts. He was caught not because of the murders, which were not yet fully known, but on an old warrant for a horse swindle he had committed in Texas. The charming Dr. Holmes was now in custody. He was arrogant, confident, and believed he could talk his way out of anything, just as he always had. He had no idea that a patient, determined detective named Frank Geyer had just unearthed the terrible secrets that would send him to the gallows. The net had closed. The hunt was over. And the true story of the murder castle was about to be revealed to a horrified world. When the police apprehended him, Holmes was, as always, calm, charming, and completely confident. He believed he was only being held for minor fraud charges, things he could easily talk his way out of. He smiled for the cameras, gave witty interviews to reporters, and denied everything. He had no idea that a patient, determined detective named Frank Geyer had just unearthed the terrible secrets of the Pittsville children's murders. And he had no idea that the full horror of what he had built in Chicago was about to be revealed to a horrified world. Spurred on by Detective Geyer's horrifying discoveries in Toronto and Indianapolis, the Chicago police launched a full-scale, top-to-bottom investigation of the strange hotel at 63rd and Wallace. The building, which Holmes had tried to burn down for insurance money, was now a crime scene. The news of the Pittsville murders had already shocked the nation, and reporters from across the country descended on Englewood. The streets around the hotel were mobbed with journalists and curious onlookers, all held back by a police line, eager for any gruesome detail. The newspapers, known for their sensational and dramatic stories, had a field day. They gave the building its infamous and unforgettable name, the Murder Castle. As investigators and firemen began to explore the building's interior, they quickly realized that the sensational newspaper stories were not an exaggeration. They were entering a real-life house of horrors, a place designed not for comfort, but for death. They started on the upper floors, the hotel section. What they found was a disorienting and terrifying maze. They walked down long, windowless corridors that twisted and turned, ending abruptly at solid brick walls. They found staircases that led to nowhere, stopping suddenly at a ceiling. They discovered over 100 small, box-like rooms, many of them completely soundproof and fitted with secret peepholes. They found doors that, when opened, revealed not a room, but a solid brick wall or a terrifying drop to the floor below. In Holmes's personal office, they found the most chilling feature of all, the massive, airtight, walk-in vault. The steel door was thick and soundproof. Inside, the walls were scarred with scratches, the final, desperate marks of his suffocating victims. The investigators then began to tap on the walls and pull up the floorboards, looking for the building's secrets. They found them. Hidden in closets and along hallways were the secret chutes, the grease slides that Holmes had used to send his victims' bodies directly to the basement. Following these chutes, the investigators descended into the final, most horrific level of the castle. The discoveries they made in the basement would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was a true devil's workshop. They found the massive, blood-stained dissecting table, with its collection of surgical knives and saws still neatly arranged. They found the giant furnace, the crematorium, and inside it, they discovered small, charred human bones and pieces of jewelry that had survived the flames. They found the vats of acid and the pits of quicklime, and at the bottom, a thick, greasy sludge that was all that was left of some of his victims. But the most damning evidence came from a large, buried pit in the corner of the cellar. As they dug, they began to unearth a horrifying collection of human remains. They found piles of human bones, some of them still with bits of flesh attached. They found clumps of long human hair, tangled in the dirt. They found blood-stained clothing belonging to women and children. They found watches, rings, buttons, and brooches, the last personal belongings of the people who had vanished inside the castle's walls. The bones of at least a dozen different victims, mostly women, were identified in that pit alone. The story of the murder castle became a global sensation. The details were so bizarre, so evil, that it seemed like something from a gothic horror novel by Edgar Allan Poe, not real life. The world was introduced to a new kind of evil, a new kind of monster for the modern, industrial age. He was not a passionate, frenzied killer. He was a methodical, intelligent, and seemingly respectable man who had used the anonymity of a big city to turn murder into a business. Back in his jail cell in Philadelphia, Holmes continued to play the part of the charming, misunderstood gentleman. He calmly denied all the accusations, smiling at the guards and writing letters to the press. But his charming facade was beginning to crack. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The world now knew about his castle of horrors. The number of his confirmed and suspected victims was growing every day. The time for lies was running out. The stage was now set for the final act in the life of H. Holmes, the trial of America's first serial killer. With the horrors of the murder castle revealed to a shocked and fascinated public, the stage was set for the final act in the life of H. Holmes. His trial began in October of 1895 in Philadelphia. Interestingly, he was not put on trial for the dozens of murders he was suspected of committing in his Chicago castle. Jurisdictional issues and the difficulty of identifying the many remains found in his basement made that case too complex. Instead, the prosecution decided to focus on a single, provable crime: the murder of his former associate, Benjamin Pitzel. The evidence for this crime, thanks to the tireless work of Detective Frank Geyer, was overwhelming. The trial was a media circus, the biggest sensation of its day. Newspapers from around the world sent their top reporters to cover the proceedings. The courtroom was packed every single day with spectators, eager to get a glimpse of the man the press had dubbed the Arch-Fiend and the monster of 63rd Street. Throughout it all, H. Holmes was a picture of calm, arrogance, and chilling self-control. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the fame that his evil deeds had brought him. He dismissed his own highly competent defense lawyers and chose to represent himself. This was a classic move for a narcissist and a manipulator like Holmes. He believed he was smarter than everyone in the room: the judge, the jury, the prosecutors. He believed he could charm and lie his way to freedom, just as he had done his entire life. He cross-examined witnesses with a cold, surgical precision, trying to trip them up and poke holes in their testimony. He questioned Detective Geyer for hours, attempting to portray the dedicated lawman as an incompetent fool. But his arrogance was his undoing. His calm, emotionless demeanor, even when faced with the most gruesome evidence, did not make him look innocent. It made him look like a monster. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. They brought in witnesses who had seen Holmes with the Pittizel children. They presented the letters he had written to the desperate Carrie Pittizel, full of cruel lies. And they presented the most powerful evidence of all, the bone fragments and teeth of young Howard Pittizel, found in the chimney of the Indianapolis cottage, and the trunk, the makeshift coffin, that had held the bodies of Alice and Nellie. While in prison awaiting his trial, Holmes began another one of his famous cons. He decided to write his life story. He sold his confession to the Hearst newspaper syndicate for a large sum of money. But his first confession was not a confession at all. It was a masterpiece of lies. In it, he claimed he was completely innocent of everything. He said Benjamin Pittizel was still alive and that the whole thing was an elaborate scam cooked up by Pittizel and others to frame him. He claimed that the murder castle was just an ordinary building, and that the sensational stories of torture chambers and secret passages were lies made up by the newspapers. He presented himself as a victim, an innocent man caught in a web of deceit. The jury, however, did not believe a word of it. After just 6 days of testimony, it took them only a few hours to find him guilty of the murder of Benjamin Pittizel. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. Faced with the reality of his own execution, Holmes's story began to change. His arrogance seemed to crumble, replaced by a desire to secure his place in history as the greatest criminal of all time. He wrote a new, much more dramatic confession. In this version, he admitted to the Pittizel murders. But he went much further. He confessed to a staggering 27 murders, providing lurid, often fictionalized details of how he had killed his victims in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto. He described their final moments, their pleas for mercy, and his own cold-hearted indifference. But even this confession was a mix of truth and lies. He confessed to killing people who were, in fact, still alive. And he denied killing people who he was strongly suspected of murdering. Then, in his final days, his story changed yet again. He wrote a third and final statement, claiming his previous confessions were a lie. He now claimed he had only killed 2 people, Julia Connor and Emmeline Sigrand. And in a final, bizarre twist, he claimed that he was not responsible for his actions. He said he was slowly turning into the devil. He claimed his face and body were physically changing, taking on the appearance of Satan himself. He was a con man to the very end, trying to manipulate the narrative to control how the world saw him. Was he a cunning liar? A pathological narcissist? Or a man who was truly, profoundly evil? The world was left to wonder. But his time for telling stories was over. His execution date was set. The man who had taken so many lives was about to lose his own. The morning of May 7, 1896, was cold and gray in Philadelphia. H. Holmes, the man who had terrified a nation, was led to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison. He remained remarkably calm to the very end. Even at the moment of his death, he tried to control his image, his final statement. He asked for his coffin to be filled with concrete and then buried 10 feet deep, with concrete poured over the top. He was afraid that grave robbers would steal his body and dissect it, just as he had done to so many of his victims. He wanted to make sure his corpse could never be studied, never be examined, never be understood by curious minds. His final words were not of remorse or apology for the lives he had taken. Instead, he said, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." Even at the precipice of death, he saw himself as a force of nature, an artist of evil, beyond human judgment. A black hood was placed over his head. At 10:10 a.m., the trapdoor beneath him opened. H. Holmes, America's first serial killer, died by hanging. The body convulsed for over 15 agonizing minutes before he was finally declared dead. The monster was gone, but the legacy of H. Holmes and his murder castle lingered long after his death. The castle itself became an object of morbid fascination and local legend. Soon after Holmes's arrest, a series of mysterious fires ravaged the building, nearly destroying it. Some said it was angry citizens, desperate to erase its evil memory from the face of their community. Others whispered of ghostly retribution, spirits of the victims taking their final revenge. The remaining charred structure stood for a few years, a horrifying monument to horror, before it was finally torn down completely in 1895. Today, a United States post office stands on the very spot where the murder castle once cast its dark shadow. a stark contrast to the horrors it replaced. The exact number of Holmes's victims remains one of history's darkest mysteries. He confessed to 27 murders, but many believe the true number was much higher, perhaps closer to 200 innocent lives. The chaos and anonymity of the World's Fair, combined with Holmes's meticulous disposal methods, made it impossible to know for sure. For every identified victim like the Pittizels, the Connors, and the Williams sisters, there were likely countless others. Unidentified bone fragments, missing persons reports that suddenly stopped being investigated, and the desperate, unanswered searches of families who never found their loved ones. These were the silent victims of the murder castle, swallowed whole by the city and by Holmes's insatiable evil. If this deep dive into true crime and chilling history has captivated you, then you're experiencing exactly the kind of stories we love to uncover. Right now, as you're immersed in this fascinating history, take a moment to hit that like button. Sharing it with others helps bring these important stories to a wider audience. And most importantly, remember to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to leave a comment below and tell me what part of Holmes's story shocked you the most, or what other historical mysteries you'd like us to explore next. Your engagement helps this channel grow and allows us to bring you more fascinating stories just like this one. The story of H. Holmes and the murder castle continues to fascinate and horrify us even today. It is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath a charming smile. It reminds us that evil can be methodical, intelligent, and driven by cold, calculated greed, not just by madness. It shows us how easily people can be deceived, how deeply trust can be betrayed, and how the veneer of respectability can hide the most monstrous of crimes. The tale of the White City and its Black Heart stands as one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. It's a story that continues to echo through time, a terrifying legend of America's first, most audacious, and most cunning serial killer. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.